Hello. How is everyone today? We are here living the dream at the Guildhall. Welcome to Texas. I don't know who said it, but yes, welcome to Texas. A great and storied tradition of game development we have. Certainly one of the great privileges and honors of being part of the Guildhall is the amazing creators we get to work with and get to interact with. And today I am so excited to have Lena, and I'm not going to attempt the full Icelandic name. I hope you will forgive me. We met a few years ago at a DICE conference, and I was so impressed by her presentation, and I thought this is something that is really would be just incredible if the students back in Guildhall could hear. And so it was an interesting story. We were at a roundtable discussion, and she said, I want everyone to come up with something they can do about diversity and inclusion. And when they came around to me, I said, well, I've decided what I could do is invite you to come and speak to our students and provide that education for them. And so for those of you who don't know or who didn't read the things we put out, Lena really has a very storied history. Many games that I know are favorites of yours, like mine. She is currently a senior producer on FIFA, one of the largest games in the world. Is it the largest game in the world? One of them, yes, certainly. And before that, a senior producer on Star Wars Battlefront. And this morning we got to discuss our shared love of the Star Wars universe and how fun that is to play in. And she has also been at Ubisoft working on The Division as a senior producer and got her start at CCP in Iceland. And of course we know that all means EVE Online, which is the digital crack of our industry. If you haven't started, don't. You'll lose large chunks of your life. And with that, I would like to introduce Lena.
I'm not Lena.
Thank you so much, Gary, and it's an honor for me to be invited to speak to all of you today on a topic that's very dear to my heart and one that I think is incredibly important for our industry. And I hope to walk you through the logic of how important it is and how important you are as the shapers of the entertainment of the future and how important those issues are. But before I dive into the topic of diversity and inclusion, I'm going to take you on a little journey and sort of tell you my story of how I accidentally. So my name, Sigurlína Ingvarsdóttir, which is why Lina is easier. And my accent have probably given away the fact that I come from a small country called Iceland. This is Reykjavik. Iceland is a country of all of 330,000 people. And that's where I grew up as a very geeky and bookish kid that rode horses and read fantasy and sci-fi novels and played pen and paper role-playing games and didn't really have any idea of what I wanted to do when I grew up. But as I was growing up, does anyone know what this is? This is when you drive from the airport in Keflavík and you're going into the city of Reykjavik, this is one of the first things that you see. This is a massive aluminum smelter. And when I was a kid, this was run by this lady, Rannveig Rist, she's still the managing director of the aluminum smelter. And she was the only woman who was sort of the head of industry or sort of prominent in the business life in Iceland. And I thought she was awesome. And I went and studied industrial engineering, and I was going to run an aluminum smelter when I grew up. This was my plan. But I didn't really realize at the time, but in hindsight, I've seen how important she was, because I could see her doing something cool and aspirational. I could also imagine myself doing it. And so even if I didn't end up running the aluminum smelter, my first job out of university was running pharmaceutical projects in a generic pharmaceutical company. I was 23, fresh out of university. I was working with people who were 15 to 20 years my seniors. They all had master's degrees or PhDs in physics or chemistry or pharmacy or biology. And I was 23 and I was their project manager. And I was incredibly awestruck by all of these and intimidated by all of these amazing people. But I learned pretty quickly that as their project manager, I could bring them a lot of value by bringing them together, by clarifying the projects that we were working on, by communicating very clearly kind of the status of the project. And it's led me to kind of think about my role as a project manager and later as a producer, as a sort of someone who is there not to lead or dominate a team, but someone who's there to bring together and to serve a team to get to the best results. And that's sort of been my producer ethos on all the projects that I worked on. And so I loved my job in the pharmaceutical industry, and but I thought, because I was 23 when I started, that I shouldn't really just stick to one job after university, that I needed to explore more and learn more things. So I quit my job and I went to work in business development for a retail holding company in Iceland, in new business development, which meant things like RFID and in-store advertising and lots of things that sounded very cool but were incredibly boring. I can't really talk about how boring they were, but the job was very prestigious, it was incredibly well paid, and one day after a few months, and I felt kind of that I'd taken such a wrong turn in my life, I used a service called futureme.org. And if you go on futureme.org, you can send yourself an email into the future. And 4 months after writing the email, I got an email that said, if you still feel like this, quit. And so I did. And at the same time, I'd gone to a presentation by the CEO of an Icelandic company called CCP. And if you've ever seen Hilmar, the CEO of CCP, present on CCP and EVE Online, he can be quite compelling. And I absolutely fell in love with what he was saying, and I fell in love with the vision and the universe of EVE. I had some friends who worked there, but I had no idea that I could work in a video game company. I thought you needed to be a programmer or an artist to make video games. And I had no idea that, in order to make video games, you need all kinds of people. But after the presentation by Hilmar, I went up to him and I introduced myself as a project manager, and he had just said that, CCP was growing so massively that they really needed people, and in particular people with project management experience. So I jumped at the chance, and 6 weeks later I started working at CCP, and that started what's now been a 12 years of adventure in making video games in many companies and many cities, and with lots of great experiences. But when I joined CCP, I was absolutely mesmerized. I couldn't believe how passionate people were about their jobs, and I couldn't believe how creative they were, and I couldn't believe that, everyone was, there were, statues and movie posters everywhere, and people were so kind of, there was no dress code, or there was, jeans and a t-shirt was the dress code, and it was so absolutely different from anything that I'd done before, and I fell in love with the culture immediately. And I had the opportunity to have some amazing experiences, given that CCP had offices also in Atlanta in the US and offices in Shanghai, and I got to go to GDC, so I traveled quite a lot. My first job was working as a producer on EVE, so I made a coffee table art book, which was a really fun project, and I integrated a voice client into EVE and got it released on Mac and Linux, and did a ton of things that I really enjoyed. But then I got a job as a senior producer overseeing kind of budgeting and planning for all of our different offices and all of our different projects, because we had more projects than just EVE Online at that time. And one of the things that I got the opportunity to do was to not only work with my Icelandic colleagues, but with colleagues in the US and in China. So I got to experience how different cultures come together, and how it can be tricky to work across cultures, because you take some things for granted as truths because they're truths in your culture, but they might be very different in another culture. As an example, one of the things that I found strange when I went to China was the fact that in Iceland, obviously the best meat of the chicken is the breast meat. But in China, the best meat of the chicken is the meat that has the most bones in it, which is the exact opposite of in Iceland. And I just found that to be such a small but interesting example of how we value different things in different cultures. And so it was a great experience. And you know, I've spent 5 fantastic years at CCP until, by sheer accident, I started talking to the people who were leading the Ubisoft Massive studio in Malmö in Sweden. And I got offered a job as the senior producer for a project that was then called Rogue, but later became The Division. And my husband and I, we had been talking about the fact that we wanted to live abroad, we wanted to have adventures. As I said, Iceland is pretty small, although it's pretty great. And so I was super intrigued, but I was also terrified. And so I sat down with a very, very good friend of mine, and I said, well, I don't really know if I'm ready to take this on, so maybe I'll just wait a little bit, and the next time an opportunity like this comes around, I'll take it. And she just deadpan looked me in the eye and she said, shut up and leave. There might not be a next time. Best advice I ever got. You know, when opportunity comes knocking, you grab it or you don't, and if you don't, you might live to regret it. And so my family and I, we moved to Malmö, and this tower there is a landmark of Malmö, the turning torso, an absolutely spectacular piece of architecture. Malmö is a wonderful city, and so we moved there. We stayed there for a year, because then I was offered a job at DICE in Stockholm to work on Mirror's Edge Catalyst as its senior producer. And so I took on Mirror's Edge for a year, because Sarah Jansson, who was the senior producer on the project, was on maternity leave. And one of the amazing things about Sweden is that when you are a female game developer, you can go on a year-long maternity leave on your project, and then you can come back and take the reins of it after you've taken your maternity leave. And so I had been a bit stressed about what I would do when Sarah came back, but fortunately for me, DICE got handed this project, Star Wars Battlefront, as an assignment. So I handed Mirror's Edge over to Sarah, and then I took on with 5 people and a deck of PowerPoint of concept art the project that would become Star Wars Battlefront, which was a fantastic adventure. So when I joined, we had a design director, an art director, a technical director, and a development director that I worked with to define the concept with the leadership of DICE. And then over the next year and a half, we grew this team of 5 to a team of more than 100 that shipped the final game. And as the senior producer, I worked leading the development team, but I also worked super closely with Lucasfilm to make sure that we were defining the game in alignment with the future vision of Star Wars. I worked with the marketing team at EA to define the marketing strategy. I had meetings one day where we were talking about that the Millennium Falcon is 35 meters long and doesn't really fit well into a multiplayer map. And the next meeting was about kind of 5-year Star Wars strategy for EA. So it was incredibly varied and interesting and exciting and absolutely exhausting as well. But it also gave me moments where I had to go to Skywalker Ranch and go to the Lucasfilm archives to, you know, walk around all the original props and concept art from the original movies, or go on set for Rogue One, or sit in a room that we had to make sure wasn't bugged because they were giving us the overview of the plot of Episode 7. So some pretty spectacular experiences. But after 4 years in Stockholm, where my husband was never very happy, it was time to move again. Battlefront was successful, and it was successful to the point where we got a Guinness World Record. So this is my Guinness World Record for the biggest selling Star Wars video game of all time. Not something I expected when I was a little kid growing up in Iceland. But then we moved to Vancouver to work on FIFA. And so for the past year and a half, I've spent time first 8 months or so as the senior producer of strategy on FIFA, defining the kind of future roadmap for that game. And now for the past year, leading the advanced team, a small team that's developing a feature set, not for the FIFA that's coming out right now, but the one that's coming out a year from now. And, as I was telling Gary earlier, making a game out of a studio like DICE on one end and making a sports video game on the other end are two completely different experiences. I thought that after my time at CCP, at Massive, and at DICE, I knew how video games were made. But sports video game are, given that they come out every year with a very short production timeline, they're an extremely precise exercise in project management, and you have hundreds of people working shoulder to shoulder in a super precise manner making these games, and it's been a pretty awesome and interesting experience to get to experience that. So this has been, the short version of my journey in video games, which has been incredibly rewarding and challenging and fun, and I've learned an amazing amount of things, and I've also been fortunate enough to get to live in Malmö, to get to live in Stockholm, and now I live in Vancouver, so it's offered me the opportunity to travel around the world with my family, experiencing things that I never thought I would. And I've learned a lot during this journey, and a lot of it has to do with culture. And so that leads me to my second half of my talk. And so, what is it that I've learned about culture, and why is it important enough for me to spend today with you talking about it? And so I think, what I'd like to tell you is that I've been a game developer for 12 years, and I've loved my work, and for a lot of that time I felt like an absolute fraud, aware that I'm very different, that I might not be enough of a gamer, that I'm not attracted to the same games and experiences as my colleagues. And I felt like when I started this that I really need to prove to you that I was legitimate, that I could tell you this, and I felt compelled to show you this picture of me as a 4-year-old playing Pac-Man. Because I've played games my entire life, but I've never considered myself a gamer. So games from when I was a kid were for boys or for men, and I borrowed their devices to play, and they played, and I dabbled, and they went to the internet and found cheat codes, and I didn't, and they were completely consumed by games, and I played sporadically, and I could only brag about my Tetris high score, or how good I was at playing Nina Williams in Tekken. And so, as long as I've thought about games and gamers, I've carried the shame of being an imposter. And during any conversation about games or gaming, I would feel like I was talking about experiences that were not intended for me. And since the days of the NES, I hadn't played games with any girls, and I was never exposed to any game console or game marketing that I felt was directed towards me. So my only game console was called the Game Boy, and I got the message. And so I've looked around me and I wondered why games don't really appeal to me, or why some games don't really appeal to me. And so, as we know, there are very few people like me involved in making games, and in particular at the setting of strategy and vision. And often the few women present don't even speak up. And so while I've gotten better at it over the years, I remember being very timid and afraid of sharing my experiences and opinions for the longest time. What do I know if I'm not a gamer? And so I've had many experiences where I felt excluded based on my gender. And my experience in the industry has led me to believe the following very strongly. As developers, we're great at making games that appeal to us. We use our tastes and our experiences to evaluate what we're building. This leads us to build experiences that cater to people like us. And as the industry making video games, conventional AAA games, is mostly millennial and Gen X white males, they resonate very strongly with an audience that mirrors them. Let's look at this picture from GDC 2016. So I've been led to believe that men and boys are interested in games and games development, and that women and girls are not, except maybe aliens like me, who are not the norm. But, however, isn't it also worth considering that maybe this is because AAA games haven't been made for or marketed for women and girls? And so I believe that games are a medium, much like movies and music and books. And what if other media producers said, men don't like movies, or women don't like books. Of course, some genres of movies and books or music might have particular gender skews based on the subject matter or style and tone, but no one questions the medium. Why should games be any different? So I did research, quite a lot of it lately, and I'd like to share with you my findings and what I think we can and should do. So let's take a look at the state of the global games market. Games are fast becoming the world's favorite pastime and are growing at the rate of 6% by revenue per year. And if you look at the dark blue section in this graph, this is mobile gaming, which continues to grow incredibly fast and will account for more than 40% of revenue by 2020. Many of us, myself included, have held the belief that women aren't gamers, and this image dispels that myth. As you can see from the pie chart, women are little less than half the gamer population in the world, and if you look at the columns in the middle, you can see that the penetration of women is the biggest on mobile, which is the platform that's growing the fastest, but they're also a significant share of the PC and console audiences. And I have to say, I was surprised by these numbers when I started looking into it. So if you look at this image from Stranger Things, a show that I, like many others, binged on during the summer of 2016, and it really shows us the stereotype of the geeky gamer from the mid-80s. And I'm sure that many of you have played Dungeons & Dragons, but if you haven't, Dungeons & Dragons is a pen and paper role-playing game system, and it's the same one that the boys in Stranger Things were playing. During the summer of 2016, the 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons was released. And this is a Facebook post from Lizelle. Lizelle is a black woman, and she's a member of the Scandinavian live-action role-playing scene. She says, "When I opened the 5th edition D&D Player's Handbook to find a black woman as the human entry, I teared up. I'm betting to many that's a tiny thing. To me, it's actually a big deal. Representation matters, and after more than 30 years of life, I can finally see myself mirrored in the worlds that I love the most." When this popped up in my Facebook feed, I teared up as well. I understood the sense of being excluded, and I was glad to see that Wizards of the Coast, makers of Dungeons & Dragons, were creating a varied world for diverse players. Emotionally, this makes sense to us, right? But what does data tell us about the power of images and representation? In 2012, the number of girls practicing archery in the US doubled. Do you know why?
Brave.
Yep, Brave and the Hunger Games. This example shows us so clearly the power of media to shape behavior. If we look at the movie industry, we've long held the belief that women couldn't carry action movies. I'm sure that Sigurlína Weaver would beg to differ, but the reality is that Hollywood has served us a myriad of action movies with white dudes saving the world as protagonists. However, what studies have shown is that the reality is that movies that have a diverse cast have more opportunity, make more money than movies that have a non-diverse cast, bringing in a more diverse audience and thus having a bigger business opportunity. This is not rocket science and has been shown through studies that were done in the summer of 2016. And so, if we look at what's been happening over the past few years, you see movies like Black Panther and Wonder Woman, and you see what Disney has done with Star Wars, where they basically rebooted the biggest IP in the world after buying Lucasfilm in 2012. What they've essentially done is changed it from a boy franchise to an everyone franchise. If you look at the posters, you can see a varied cast of different ethnicities, gender, and age, inviting everyone into that galaxy far, far away. The Force Awakens was the most popular film in 2015, and Rogue One was the second most popular film in the world the year after. We don't really have similar studies yet for our industry, but there are no reasons that games should be any different than movies. People gravitate towards experiences that make them feel invited and included. When I was a kid, does anyone know this character? When I was a kid, I remember latching onto an image of a high-powered female lawyer in LA Law, an 80s lawyer show. And from there on, I had an image of myself in the future, having a cool and important job, working a lot, making money. And so I remembered this when I read a study that showed that female characters in film and TV motivate women to be more ambitious, more successful, and have even given them the courage to break out of abusive relationships, for real. I did not end up as a high-powered lawyer. The future had something a bit more weird and wonderful in store for me. So, I hope that I've illustrated two things clearly so far. One, that there's a significant opportunity in appealing to a broad audience base with the games that we make. And two, that as creators of culture, we have a responsibility towards our audience to not mindlessly promote stereotypes. And I also hope that through the examples that I've given, I've inspired you to question your assumptions about who your audience is. So that brings me back to our industry. Here's another GDC picture. It's not very diverse. It really gives me hope to look around here because this is a diverse room and I'm very glad to see that. But our industry unfortunately still is a mostly white and a mostly male audience, which makes games for a mostly male crowd. And so over 11 years, I worked in 4 studios in 3 countries with fantastic people on amazing games. I worked with a lot of men and a few women in comparison, and it appears to me that as an industry, we tend to hire people that are like us. I don't think that's an issue that's specific to the games industry, and I don't think it's particularly surprising, but I think that our ability to create diverse experiences is very related to the diversity of our teams, and so I think we need to look at this, what I call this process of self-replication. And so I'd like to take a few examples. In the 1970s, 6% of the musicians in the top 5 symphonic orchestras in the US were women. During the 80s and the 90s, most symphonic orchestras adopted a process of blind auditions where the musician played behind the screen. Do you know what happened immediately after the blind auditions happened?
More women.
At first, absolutely nothing. Do you know why? Because the audience heard the musicians walk on their way over to the chair and could discern from the sound of high heels when a woman was playing. This was addressed by having the musicians remove their shoes. The blind auditions increased women's chances of playing in the orchestra significantly, and the number of women in the orchestras had more than tripled in 1993 when the study was done. And so what the study showed is the classic example of the unconscious bias. The judges at the auditions were in all likelihood proficient music lovers, well-educated and well-intended and open-minded, at least in their own view. But what the study showed is that they were also biased in favor of men. We are all biased. Our brain makes snap decisions based on previous associations, our biases, all the time. It's how we operate. And it's the reason that we often surround ourselves by like-minded people by choice. In order to understand our own biases, we can take word association tests, so-called implicit association tests, online. Through doing that, I found out that I'm ableist. That is, I am prejudiced towards disabled people. I'm not proud of it, and I don't want to be, but I am. But right now, though, I am also aware of it, which hopefully means that I can correct for it going forward. And this unconscious bias shapes our worldview, and it manifests in our processes and our culture. We might say, it's really hard to recruit women. Not many apply, and we don't want to change our criteria to bring more of them in. Fair enough, I've had this conversation more than a few times during my career. But let's think about it a little bit. Why do so few people apply? One factor is obviously the gender ratio of the discipline that's in question, and in some fields it's pretty dismal, such as in engineering, where the ratio of women who graduate has gone down from 37% in the mid-80s down to about 18% in 2013. But I don't even think that many game companies have about 18% engineers, and there are lots more disciplines than engineering that make up game companies. So my theory is that the reason that we have a hard time recruiting women into our companies is not just that there are few women that graduate from the fields, it's also that for many of them, they don't perceive games companies to be feasible places to work. And so we need to acknowledge that it's hard to recruit and that we need to do something about it. So, as we know, the process of hiring a new member of staff can be long and complex. We source applicants from industry events, through LinkedIn, and often most successfully through other members of staff. We post job ads, we host events for new grads, we conduct numerous interviews with various panels to evaluate candidates searching for the highest level of competency for the role. And so if our intent is to get the best person for the job, our sourcing should attract and treat equally the broadest possible sample of candidates, right? To be able to do that, we need to be impartial and our process needs to be unbiased. Is it? As we look at our talent pipelines, I find it very helpful to think about it as any other manufacturing process. We feed ingredients, who are job candidates, into our machine, we process them through a defined criteria, and the output of it is an employee who has the required skills and is a culture fit. And for many of us, this machine seems to be a self-replicating machine. We've unconsciously optimized this to give us more of the same. So if we're super happy with the current state of our company, our products, and the diversity of our staff, we should proceed absolutely exactly as we always have. However, if we would like to change things up, bring in more perspectives, which is why we're doing this, we need to change the machine. Einstein famously said that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. So how do we change it then? We take a look at how do we represent our company externally? How do we recruit? What language do we use in our recruiting materials? How do we talk about working hard and playing hard? Are we communicating in a way that attracts more of the same and are surprised when nothing changes? How do we assess what are important skills and experiences? And most importantly, when we ask these questions, and many other like them, we don't just ask ourselves and people who are like us, we ask the people who are different. Language is incredibly important. Let me give you an example. Recently, I was involved in creating a vision statement for a studio that I worked at. It was me and a group of my peers, and we were working together, and we had come up with something that was lofty and inspiring, and it had a line about creating awe-inspiring immersive experiences. A coworker of mine suggested that that line be changed to dominating awe-inspiring immersive experiences. And so when comparing the two versions, I wanted to be a part of the studio that was creating awe-inspiring immersive experiences, but the dominating version left me cold, and I didn't see myself as a part of that future. And so language is an important part of the equation, and something that we really, really need to be more conscious of. However, looking at how we hire is just one side of the coin, and it's the easier side of the coin. And I want to take one other example of language, because I think how we talk about our players and how we talk about our developers is incredibly important. And so during my entire career, I've often been addressed as a part of a group in this way. Hey guys, or guys, we should. And I have not felt included as a guy. I haven't wanted to make a fuss, so I haven't really, this is probably the first time I talk about it, because guy literally means a man. And I'm not one, not all of us are. And so we also often talk about our players as a he. In groups, we address each other as guys, and then we talk about him when we refer to the player. Can you see how we perpetuate a stereotype of game developers as men and players as men as well? I don't think this is done to intentionally exclude anyone from the team or to focus on a smaller market opportunity by omitting half of the human race, but I think it makes it harder for anyone who's not a guy to feel included and invited into our teams. And the numbers show that it limits our market opportunity. I talked about one side of the coin before, but I think the other side is culture. Have you seen this movie?
Oh, yeah.
This picture is from The Wolf of Wall Street, and it shows stockbrokers betting on dwarf throwing. It's a wonderful example of toxic combination of testosterone, money, and cocaine. And I think it's to the absolute extreme of masculine culture, and that at gaming companies, no one throws dwarfs around. But the following things have all happened to or around women that I know. At some companies, it's customary to give employees swords or gun replicas in recognition of long-standing service. There have been naked wrestling matches and after-dinner trip to strip clubs. Executives have told extremely sexist jokes, and there have been social events where senior women have been excluded for no good reason. And so a deep dive into culture would definitely warrant its own presentation, one that I'm not giving right now. But I would like to talk a little bit about what is starting to happen. So this discussion, fortunately, is starting to gain momentum within our industry, as it is within other industries as well. And so at EA, we've set up employee resource groups, or ERGs, to increase diversity within the company. We have a number of different ones. We have the women's ERG, we have the black ERG, we have the Hispanic ERG, the Asian and Pacific Islander ERG, the LGBTQ ERG, and even more. And they all have executive sponsorship, and they're intended so that we can assess the current situation at the company and drive for change wherever needed. And so as a member of the Women's ERG, I have had a platform to discuss with other staff members interested in the topic, and I've been pulling together some of the research to show to the company that I've shown to you today. At EA, we're very proud to build experiences that have diverse protagonists, and our BioWare games and The Sims are examples of franchises that have really pushed the envelope when it comes to same-sex relationships and representations of different genders in games. And we continue the dialogue and we continue the change. We added women to FIFA in 2016. We added them to WNBA, added the WNBA to NBA Live 2 years ago, and we've added women to Battlefield. Not everyone liked that, but it's the right thing to do. There is a lot to do still, but I'm really, really glad that we are bringing focus to the topic and started to talk about it. It's not always easy to speak up and to bring a different perspective, but it is needed for our industry to develop that we do that. I want to show you this. These are 4 questions, and as you build your games and as you think about your audience, we have found these incredibly helpful. Julianne Cromit is a VP of diverse representation, I think, at Disney, and she came and spoke at EA, and she brought 4 questions that you can use to evaluate any creative work. And the questions are, how often do we seek to tell stories of underrepresented people? Are we portraying people of diverse backgrounds in an authentic manner? Are we imparting any unconscious bias into our narratives? And how diverse and inclusive is our product? And we found that just by asking these questions very early on in the project that we're working on, we can make significant changes that have a great impact on being more inclusive to all gamers, just by being mindful about it. And so, to summarize, today I've shared with you how I've often felt lonely and excluded as both a game developer and a gamer. I told you the story of Lizelle, who loves Dungeons and Dragons, and demonstrated the power of media to shape behavior through role models. I've shown you that women are almost half of the gaming population and that they play games on all platforms, and that research from the movie industry proves that appealing to a broad audience through a diverse cast brings a greater return than not doing it. There's certainly an opportunity for all of us to create experiences for a broader crowd, but in order for us to go after that audience, we must invite a broader group of people into our companies and our culture. The first step to do that is to examine how we hire and understand what needs to change with our process for us to be more successful in moving the needle towards a more varied teams. The second is to take stock of what our culture is and whether it's welcoming to all or only to some. It's not an easy task for us to change from what we are into what we need to become, but it is certainly worth the effort. And so in closing, and especially relevant to you, for all of you in this room, I would ask you to remember that we wield incredible and important power in shaping the future of entertainment, a future that will inspire and influence the way that children perceive themselves. Remember the archery example. This is our power. Thank you. to answer any questions you have. Yes?
Hi, I'm Herschel. I'm a producer at SMU Guildhall. I'm curious about how do you implement seeking underrepresented stories or narratives or populations when it comes to games that are fantasy in nature? It's something that's purely animals. How would you go about doing that?
Sorry, so something that's purely...
Purely fantasy, like it's a game entirely about animals, or a game, it doesn't involve humans.
I think if you have any kinds of characters in the game...
Question?
Yes. So how would you go about representing diversity in a game that's purely fantasy and might even only include animals, as an example? Well, I think ethnicity might not be a variant there, but looking at what are the archetypes that if you're humanizing the animals and giving them personalities, then I think still the same things would apply even though the avatars are different, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yes.
So in a lot of games I've noticed that they do end up putting people of color, like other genders, but they put them as add-on. They put them just to have them there just to say that we have that instead of actually integrating in the game. So how would you say that they will spend as much time as they do, let's say, a white character to a person of color in order to have the same integration for both sides?
So if I understand the question correctly, it's you've experienced that while games may add people of color, they feel more like add-on than kind of deeply integrated into the design of the game from the get-go. In that case, I think the 4 questions that I shown, which ask, are you representing people with diverse backgrounds authentically, is a good one. And I think I don't think diversity means that you create a game in the way that you always have, and then you add in a smattering of people who are not white males or who are different as an afterthought or as a checklist exercise. I think it starts with thinking deeply about who are your protagonists that you're telling the story about, and why are they who they are. Yes?
So, as a person in a leadership position, how do you make space on your teams for people who might be less represented to come forward and have perspective and add that to your games? Like, what are some techniques you use for that?
As a person in leadership, how do I make sure to make space for people who are underrepresented within the game teams? I try and be mindful about it. I think that you have dimensions of, some people are extroverted, some people are introverted, some people will speak up in a room, some people will prefer to communicate one-on-one. I have through my career, I've often found that women within the teams that I work on kind of sort of find their way somehow into my office, and I spend some time with them talking particularly about what it's like to be a woman in a male-dominated environment. But I think the short answer is I try to be mindful about it, and I try to make sure that the meetings that I run aren't dominated by always the usual suspects, that I call on others to solicit their opinions if they're not offering them. Yes?
In hiring people for your teams, you do face-to-face interviews. How do you stop unconscious bias and increase diversity when you're still looking for a culture fit?
How do you stop yourself, or how do you stop your unconscious bias to impact you as you are conducting face-to-face interviews with people that you're hiring for your team? I think that's it's very tricky, and I think one of the things that some people have found useful is to make sure that as an example, when you're interviewing candidates, that you have a diverse panel that's interviewing them. As an example.
Interesting.
Okay.
You're still on the live stream. I don't know what's going on. I'll fix it.
Okay, can you hear me in the back? Okay, so I think that one of the interesting examples, it's not directly an answer to your question, but it's related. So I am sometimes asked to come and speak at recruiting events in universities. And EA does a lot of outreach where they go, they have, university relations people that go speak to universities, and they have someone from the dev teams come and speak to the students. And I went with one of our university relations people to speak at UBC in Vancouver not that long ago. And it was a mixed class of about maybe 60% males and 40% females in mostly, I think, computer science graduates. And what the university recruiter told me was that after my session where I gave a presentation, which was a much shorter version of this one, she said, we had a great discussion after for like almost 45 minutes or so, and she said, what I noticed was that the women in the audience spoke up a lot more than they do when we have a male speaker and a male developer come in. And so we often have interview panels, and we now try and make sure that the interview panels are never just single gender, that we have a varied group of people that interviews people, and that we also, when we're assessing something that's as nebulous as a culture fit, sometimes culture fit feels like, hey, you look like all of my other buddies and I can see you, fit in really nicely as we go out and kind of have a beer. And, maybe that's not really a great reason to hire anyone. Yes?
This is more about, whenever you release a game that has this inclusion in it, and there are obviously a lot of people opposing it. And do you feel like, both from a business and social and cultural standpoint, that it is you should consider these other people, and there's a way that you tackle this so that you don't alienate them?
So if I understand the question correctly, is that when you broaden the profile of the protagonists of your game to be more inclusive, there will be people who are opposed to it because they feel like you're catering to a broader audience. And do I feel like we should take those people's opinions into account? I think, as an example, I feel like, if you look at the example of Star Wars and what they did between kind of episodes 4 to 6 and then in 7, 8, 9, where they consciously made an effort to broaden the sort of demographic profile of their audience, they didn't find that to be a deterrent to their commercial success. They actually found it to be very additive to their commercial success. So no, I don't think that I obviously don't think we should change the creative DNA and the core of our experience in a different manner, because I think that would alienate the core. But I think inviting more people into an experience does not mean that those that are already there feel disinvited. Yes?
So I know you talked a little bit about being careful about the language we use, and then also hiring people, diverse people. And then I know some of the sort of counter arguments I've seen towards those are towards in regards to language, that some people say, well, you're just being sort of too sensitive about the language. For instance, we're saying that's so gay. Maybe we're not actually against gay people. We're just sort of using the word in that way. Or for instance, in regards to hiring diverse people, some people say then it might just end up in a situation where just hiring more Asians just for the sake of having more Asians rather than actually hiring qualified individuals. So how would you go about kind of addressing those kinds of arguments?
So the question was, how do I kind of counter the argument of people saying that, monitoring or policing the language to not be offensive is just kind of being too sensitive, and that hiring more people from kind of a different ethnicities such as Asians is, becomes this checklist activity. You're hiring someone because they're Asian or they're female rather than because they're the most qualified one. And I think the people who reject kind of other people being considerate in their language are generally not the people who would take offense at the language. So they feel like you're taking away their freedom to kind of be inconsiderate and offensive to others. But they're generally not the people who have experienced, feeling excluded based on language. So I wouldn't, be too sensitive to those arguments. And on the hiring people based on race and gender, I think, if the general population has a particular set of composition, and then the composition within a company has a drastically different composition, I think we can infer that there's something, and if we think that, race or gender doesn't have anything to do with, intelligence and competence, then if our smaller population is vastly different than our larger population, then it stands to reason that there's something happening in the process of these people being selected that's excluding these other populations. Yes?
I have two questions from our Twitch audience. The first is, in your current studio at EA, do you have a group that heads diversity and inclusion, or are those types of hires spread out throughout your teams?
So the question is, does EA Vancouver, where I work, have a group that is responsible for diversity and inclusion? No, the answer is that there is a group across the entirety of EA that focuses on diversity and inclusion. But then we have these ERGs who work in all different locations and offices.
Okay. Thank you. And the second question is, are there any industry groups that you recommend reaching out to that could help increase, this must be from a developer, increase our recruiting pool for diversity?
Sorry, can you repeat that question?
Sure. Are there any industry groups that you recommend reaching out to that could help increase our recruiting pool?
Yeah, so the question was, are there any industry groups that I would recommend reaching out to increase the diversity? I think this is something that you tackle on multiple levels. So one, I think you do it on I think we would do well as game developers to speak in elementary schools and high schools to alert kids at a much younger age of both genders about the opportunity of working in video games. But I also think there are various groups like Women in Gaming and Latinos in Gaming who have kind of active communities that I think we should be reaching out to.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I know we could spend a long time here asking questions because they're so interesting, but some of you need to get to class. So I need to make sure that's possible in my other role. We thank you again for coming, and we hope everyone had a great time.